this webinar. Good afternoon, everyone. I thank you for joining this webinar. This is a short 30 minutes webinar. We'll talk about a new regulation called 23 NYCRR Part 500. Or I can say in general, we'll talk about IS risk management. I'll try to wrap it up quicker so you can enjoy some of the leftover time. Please hold on to any questions you may have till the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Okay, let's start about NYCRR, a new regulation implemented by Department of Financial Services or DFS. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Sam Vora. I co-founded CompCiti in 1996 to provide IT management services to small and mid-sized businesses. Later, we broadened our portfolio by adding IT auditing and compliance services. I have been involved with IT compliance for over 15 years, have been maintaining SOX regulated IT networks since SOX compliance was introduced in 2002. SOX or Sarbanes-Oxley, it's similar to NYCRR compliance, but it applies to publicly traded companies. We get audited by one of the big four accounting firms for managing our listed clients' IT systems. Doing the SOX compliance for over 15 years, we are very familiar with what auditors or examiners look for. SOX controls are in general higher or more strict than NYCRR. Okay, let's talk about NYCRR, a new regulation implemented by Department of Financial Services or DFS. As we all know, financial services industry is a significant target of cyber criminals, and DFS wants financial industry to proactively increase their cybersecurity program. Given the seriousness of this issue and risk involved, certain regulatory minimum standards are warranted. To enforce these standards, a new regulation named NYCRR was introduced in March of 2017. This regulation is designed to promote the protection of customers' information, I should say customer personal information, as well as information technology systems of regulated entities. Why NYCRR? Why this regulation? DFS has been closely monitoring ever-growing threat posed to the financial sector. Recently, cyber criminals have sought to exploit vulnerabilities in order to access sensitive information. Cyber criminals can cause significant monetary losses for DFS regulated entities, as well as for New York consumers whose private information may be revealed or stolen for illicit purposes. NYCRR applies to individuals and non-governmental entities operating in the state of New York under authorization of the banking law, insurance law, or financial services law, and are known as covered entities. Some examples would be insurance companies, independent insurance adjusters, as well as financial services companies and banks. A covered entity, however, is exempted from certain regulations if it has less than 10 employees, including any independent contractors of the entity or its affiliates in New York who are responsible for the business of the entity. or if any organization with less than 5 million in revenue for each of last 3 fiscal years is also exempted from certain provisions of the of this regulation. So why does this matter? For smaller companies, it's a matter of life and death. Most of the smaller companies who get breached, 60% of them, they go out of business. They cannot revive from this cyber attack. And for bigger organizations, it's a loss of reputation and hefty penalties from authorities. All these requirements, compliance requirements, are mandatory controls, not recommendations. A key thing to remember is NYDFS has stated that an organization may not submit their certificate of compliance unless they have met all the requirements for that period or for that phase. Certificate of compliance, it's available on the DFS website. Senior management or board has to sign this certificate and submit with DFS after making sure that all the controls for that specific phase have been in place. I'll talk about the phases in the next slide, but by now everything has to be in place because this was introduced back in 2017 and it was enforced in certain regulations. Not everything was implemented right on March 2017. So how to get compliant? This process starts with creating a cybersecurity program. Cybersecurity program consists of various components. Top of the list is assets inventory. We need to identify all the assets we have so that we can protect them. If we don't know what we have, we cannot protect them. The second thing is creating policies. If you don't already have those, examples could be information security policy, data governance and classification policy, assets inventory, disaster recovery and business continuity, and the list goes on. All the policies has to be well documented. Like if you have a policy of that you change your passwords every X number of days, that has to be documented as well. Let me say, if as per DFS, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. If they come to examine you, the very first thing they're going to ask you is your policies and procedures, and they're looking for documents. You may have all those controls in place technically, but they want to look at the papers first, what your documented policies are, and then later on to confirm, they may ask you, randomly some samples of your policies if they have been properly implemented and enforced or not. The next thing is procedures. You should have documented procedures to implement those policies. Data classification is the next in the list. What it means is you need to identify what kind of data you have, classify it. Example could be sensitive information, critical information, or public information. Classification is necessary to find out where you need the more protection. The public information does not need as much protection as your sensitive or critical information. Risk assessment. Once you have identified your assets inventory and you have classified your data, you need to do the risk assessment, meaning how much exposure to any specific asset or information what will be the damage or what will be the risk if that asset or information is compromised. With the risk assessment, we determine how much resources we should be spending to protect any information or inventory, and does it make sense to spend those many resources. An example could be if you have an asset and the cost of that asset is much less than protecting it, you may not want to protect that asset because you can simply replace that asset. In case of information, of course, it's a different story, especially if it's a sensitive or critical information, you have to save it. And obviously, the cost cannot supersede the expense to protect it. The next thing in the cybersecurity program is access control. We give access to our employees so that they can do their job. So that access should be role-based. An example could be employees should have access to only information what they need for their job responsibilities. Example could be marketing department do not need access to HR. HR department do not need access to finance data. So all this data should be categorized, kept separate, and only people who need access to that specific data should have access to it. Finance department need access to finance department. HR need access to HR. HR does not need to have access to finance department. The next thing in the access control comes is multi-factor authentication. Let me take a step back. When we do the role-based access, it's all credentials-based, meaning every employee or every user has a username and password to access the data. And in a breach, that those credentials are compromised. If a employee share by mistake or by clicking on a phishing email, give away his or her credentials, there should be a second form of authentication or control before an unauthorized person can get access to the information. That's where MFA, multi-factor authentication, comes in the play. So in today's world, because of all those phishing or spear phishing scams, we cannot only rely on one form of authentication, which is username and password. So what MFA does is when you type in your username and password, most likely it asks you to re-authenticate. It sends you a signal or a text on your mobile device and you re-authenticate. The advantage is if someone is successful in stealing your credentials, they still cannot have access to your data, or they have to do a lot more work. They need to hack into your device and then they will be able to get access to your data. Hacking into your device is possible, but again, we are creating hurdles for cyber criminals to get access, unauthorized access to your data. Users awareness training is the next in access control. Like I said, most of the times these credentials are compromised through phishing emails. So training or creating awareness among your team is the key for this cybersecurity program. There should be a proper documented process in place, how you're gonna train them and test them so they understand the difference between good and bad emails and how they can safely surf the internet. Last thing in the list is incident management. Doesn't matter what we do to protect our data, but there are chances or good chances that a breach can happen. When a breach happens, you should have a incident management plan, again, documented incident management plan in place. You need to do it now. So if a breach happens, what actions you need to take, all the authorities you need to inform, who will do what in case of that incident, all that has to be defined now. I'll take one example that DFS requires if there is a breach, if any information or personal information is compromised, you need to inform all the relative parties within 72 actual hours. So you need to make that plan now, who will be taking in charge and how they will do all the steps of that recommended incident management. And you also need a chief information security officer who will be creating and managing this cybersecurity programs and all components of it. Here are some important dates which we talked about when this regulation was first introduced. It wasn't, and for all the parts of it were not enforced on the very first day. It went into effect in different periods. The last date was March 1st of this year, which was also a 2-year transitional period for the compliance. So by March 1st, 2019, DFS expects all the covered entities to be in 100% compliance. By the way, this last date, March 1st, refers to third-party services provider. If you are using any third-party contractor or subcontractor who helps you or contributes to your business, and if they are exposed to the personal information of your consumers, you have to make sure that this third-party entity follows the same guidelines as you do, and it is your job to make sure they are following those. And if their systems are compromised or breached, they have to inform you within 72 hours. So we talked about all the components of getting into compliance, basically making the cybersecurity program. CompCiti can help you with your cybersecurity program. CompCiti has the knowledge, experience, and qualification to assess your IT infrastructure, to identify all the gaps to comply with NYCRR, and create an action plan to fill those gaps. We have skill sets and technology to cover all parts of the compliance. In addition to subject knowledge and expertise, we also need reliable tools for disaster recovery, vulnerability scanning, users awareness training, SIM, assets inventory, multi-factor authentication, IPS, IDS, and that list also goes on. CompCiti has partnered with various solution providers to this end, and we have mastered and tested all the solutions, and we are ready to deploy them. We can customize our solutions as per your requirements. If you have a CISO on staff, we can work with your team in the areas you need help. Or if you need to, a specific thing, if you want to set up multi-factor authentication or vulnerability scanning or just user awareness training or combination of any of those. If you want CompCiti to take over entire CISO role, then yes, we can create and implement the entire cybersecurity program for you. We can also provide a high-level summary to your senior management or board so they know where do we stand in the entire process. We were recently hired by an international bank in New York City. They needed a vulnerability scanning before their due date, which was coming in 3 weeks. They wanted us to run a vulnerability scan and give them a remediation plan. Because we have all of these tools ready to be deployed, we were able to set up, identify their requirements, run the scanning, give them the remediation plan, and an executive summary report within 2 weeks. I jumped ahead on my slides quickly. So here is the summary. NYCRR is here, and if you are a covered entity, you need to comply. Process is to appoint a CISO to make a cybersecurity program for your organization. The DFS allows a provision where CISO does not have to be on your payroll. You can outsource this responsibility. We will reach out to all the attendees to schedule a complimentary compliance assessment session. This process starts with a discovery session where we interview you regarding your IT infrastructure. Depending on the size and number of locations your organization have and how big your infrastructure is, this process may take a few hours to a couple days. We then analyze the information gathered and come up with an assessment report. Another point I want to add is we don't necessarily need to implement the entire remediation plan immediately. What's necessary is to create a justified remediation timeline. An example could be if you have a vulnerability which cannot be patched because the resolution interfere with the application you use or legacy application you need for your business operations, you need to create a timeline to make necessary changes or updates to this application so it can run on the secured or recommended settings or environment. That's all I have for today, and now I will open a Q&A session. You're still in mute mode. Please type in any questions you have. I'll try to answer them all. If I can't get to any questions right now because of the time constraint, I'll definitely reply later by email. So here is the first question, which is basically reconfirmation of the CISO. Can this be outsourced? Answer is yes. As I mentioned earlier, you can outsource this responsibility to a third-party vendor, but accountability still stays with the senior management of the covered entity. It also makes sense to outsource this function to an experienced and professional company rather than keeping it in-house. Second question I have is on the frequency of vulnerability assessment. I know most organizations, they do it on quarterly and some do it on biannual basis, but it can be tailored to your specific environment. In addition to your scheduled plan, you must also run a vulnerability assessment and I would say an audit whenever you make any significant changes to your environment. The third question I have is how to respond to a breach within 72 actual hours if a breach happens on a late Friday following a long weekend. That's a very legitimate question, and answer is you have to come up with the answer and document your answer now. What will be your incident response? Who will execute that on a Friday night at 11 which is following a long weekend. And remember, everything has to be documented for DFS. If it's not documented, it doesn't exist. Here is the end of this webinar, and as I promised, I am concluding this early. You still have 2 minutes left for yourself. I thank you all again for listening to this webinar, and we will be reaching out to you individually to schedule a complimentary discovery session. Have a nice day.